Welcome to the APUSH theme video, Identity. The description of the identity theme from the course description book is, this theme focuses on the formation of both American national identity and group identities in U.S. history. Students should be able to explain how various identities, cultures, and values have been preserved or changed in different contexts of U.S. history, with special attention given to the formation of gender, class, racial, and ethnic identities. Students should also be able to explain how these sub-identities have interacted with each other and with larger conceptions of American national identity. So the first big question for the theme identity is how and why have debates over American national identity changed over time? And then ID1 specifically analyze how competing conceptions of national identity were expressed in the development of political institutions and cultural values from the late colonial through the antebellum periods. What's becoming similar about all of these is, first of all, elites and their ties to British culture, Anglicization, but then also their cultures are similar because of the British tie, but also their laws, their governing bodies, they all have some sort of representative government, their beliefs in religious freedom, all of those sort of things do create some unifying factors. One thing that unites the colonies in the late 17th century is their unified dislike of the British trying to take stricter control over the colonies. And one example of that is the Dominion of New England, which lasted from 1686 to 1689. In the beginning, it was just Massachusetts, Plymouth, New Hampshire, and Maine that were part of this Dominion. And then later on, it came to include Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. And the whole point of this was to tighten control on trade and allow less independent government. And part of this was in conjunction with the Navigation Acts. The first one was passed in 1651, but there are a whole bunch of them. And again, this is the English trying to gain greater control over the colonies and their trade. Basically said that everything that was exported from the colonies had to go through England or the English colonies. And of course, the colonists didn't like this. The Dominion of New England was very unpopular. The first person who was put in charge of it by the British, Joseph Dudley, the colonists wouldn't work with him, and he was replaced by Sir Edmund Andros. And he set up a system where there was no jury trial for smugglers. He made the Puritans share churches with the Anglicans, because that was another goal of all this, was to reinforce the authority of the Anglican Church, especially in New England. And so he'd make them share churches, and he limited or suspended town meetings. So in 1689, in Boston, Andros was put in jail, and then from there, the English decided to give up on the Dominion of New England, and all of the charters were pretty much restored, with some exceptions after that. And one thing that you do see, if you'll recall, is that the British, over and over again, they'll try to gain some control, and then they'll back off of it because they'll get distracted by things that are going on in Europe at that time, and they don't have time for the colonies anymore. And you'll remember this is called, wait for it, what do you remember? Salutary neglect. These early attempts by the British government to take control led to increasing unity in the colonies against that control. So it created a small sense of nationalism or American identity. And those early resistance movements were influenced by several things. The experiences that the colonists had with self-government. They are used to ruling themselves and expect to be able to have a say in their government. Enlightenment ideas are popular, especially amongst the elites in American society. Ideas about individual rights and limitations on the government. And then the Great Awakening is also a unifying factor in the colonies, although there are divisive elements to it. If you'll recall, the Great Awakening is the spread of religious fervor in the colonies during the late 17th century. And what's happening is that you have these revival preachers going around, and they're spreading new forms of Protestantism, Baptist and Methodist, kind of going against the teachings, say, of the Puritans, where you have to be the elect and all of that, that there's a certain elite group that can be Christians. And they're spreading this religious fervor and arguing over the nature of religion and whether there should be an established church or whether people should have the freedom within the colony. And it eventually leads to the elimination of the established church. This movement tends to criticize the merchants and the wealthy planters and appeals to your common man. But the Great Awakening, in encouraging the common man to think about his religious values, also encourages individual thinking and confidence in the common man that they have the ability to think about other things like government and what's right and wrong there. Ultimately, there can be a lot of division here because they're arguing over all of these issues, but it leads to a lot of printed material being disseminated and disseminating into different colonies where you're getting information that's shared amongst colonies and reactions amongst colonies. It's, for the good or the bad, something that everybody in the colonies is experiencing, this Great Awakening. So it's something that is inclusive of all the colonies and bringing people together and having this shared experience, and bringing more people into thinking independently about what's going on in society. There's much more to the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, and you have a reading on it and did an activity on it. I believe it's in Unit 2, so you may want to go back and look at that now or make a note to go back and take a look at that later. By 1754, the British were again making attempts to take stricter control over the colonies, and the colonists again resisted that control. The need for greater control of the colonies came after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in Europe, and the British thought that the colonists should help pay for their defense, and they began to issue all sorts of new taxes and new controls on the American people. And of course, they were not too excited about this. And one of the things that shows their greater sense of unity during this period is they developed the Committees of Correspondence. And the Committees of Correspondence was designed to spread information about how different colonies were fighting back against the British, and also what the British were doing to the different colonies, to kind of spread the word and create a unified message and action against the British. And this is the first time the colonists have ever come together to do something like this. Eventually, colonial resistance to the British attempts for greater control lead to an independence movement, which rested on the arguments over the rights of British subjects, the rights of the individual, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. A large amount of leadership came from the elite groups in colonial society, but you also had groups of laborers, artisans, and women who were deeply involved in the cause. One group that was representative of people that were not elites was the Sons of Liberty, which was established in 1765 in Boston to fight the Stamp Act. And while there were a couple of elite members like Sam and John Adams, most of the people were merchants, artisans, lawyers, people like that. a lot of the people involved were printers and people in the media, and they worked to get the message out through the media what was going on, and that became an important role. But it's important that people besides the elite are knowing what's going on in government and acting out against it, that it's not just an elite movement. The Sons of Liberty used violence to try to drive the government officials, people who collected the taxes, out of the colonies and to show that the colonists were in charge. But then they also used the media to get the message out as well. Just as a side note, there's lots of interesting things about the Sons of Liberty. There's apparently a motorcycle gang, the Sons of Liberty, and then there's also a show on, it looks like, the History Channel about the Sons of Liberty. Found all this while I was looking for this picture. Another group that was important in the revolution was women, outside that elite group of men. Most of them were elite women who were involved in this and had connections to powerful men. In keeping with the Enlightenment, you see girls getting more of an education. One example would be Mercy Otis Warren. Her father, her husband, and her brother were all involved in the revolution, and she wrote poetry and plays about and carried on correspondence with a lot of important men during the period and gave them advice and kept them in touch with what was going on in Plymouth, where she lived. Another influential woman of the time was Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams. You'll recall that she wrote the famous letter to John when he was writing the Constitution that asked him to remember the ladies. Another group that was influential in the revolution besides the elite were the farmers. And this is an example of farmers who were involved. Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which was written by John Dickinson, and who was influential in the revolutionary movement from Pennsylvania. And what he talked about in these letters was the issue of the British really not having internal control in the colonies, that they didn't have the right to pass revenue taxes in the colonies, and that if they did so, that the colonists should fight back, and that colonies should support one another in fighting back against these British actions. And that's the excerpt you see here from Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. While there were a number of groups in the American colonies who were supportive of rebellion and wanted independence from the British, there were a number of people who remained loyal to the British. And so you want to remember that there is that group as well. Ultimately, despite the fact that the British had a more advanced military, the Americans do win because of their ideological commitment to the cause and because they had support from the French. The new government that's created will reflect Americans' ideas of what it is to be an American and what their government should be. One of the things that will continue to be reflected is the idea of American exceptionalism that was started in Winthrop's City Upon a Hill speech. That basically Protestant evangelical religious fervor, that they believe that they are a chosen people blessed with liberty. Americans, especially the political thinkers or the elite of the time, were also highly influenced by the Enlightenment philosophers like we've talked about before. The main one that was big to them was John Locke. And John Locke talked about individual rights, the life, liberty, property idea. And he also talked about the consent of the governed, that government existed because the people gave the government the right to govern, basically. And so these became kind of the ideas that people have about what it is to be an American and what American beliefs are, and then those were then translated into the government. American belief in the superiority of Republican self-government can be seen in two documents of the Revolutionary period. One is Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Common Sense was written by Thomas Paine to encourage people that revolution had to happen now, that they had to break away from the British, that there wasn't like any kind of reform that was going to happen. And George Washington had Common Sense read to all his troops. Common Sense was written in a very American way. Instead of embracing the use of Latin and philosophical speak that a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers used, he went the American route of using the Bible, and addressed a lot of Protestant ideology for and against revolution. So it's a very American document championing Republican government. And then you have the Declaration of Independence, which again, Enlightenment ideas, Republican governments, we the people, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, expressing those Enlightenment ideas, and also the use of the we, showing that there is an American identity, and this is what Americans believe. While the growing sense of American identity created during the Revolution indicates a growing sense of the belief in individual rights and equality and Republican government, what you end up seeing in the governments that are created is also a reflection of the fear in the colonist that has been created by the actions of the British and the fear of letting too many people be involved, the fear of the masses. And the Articles of Confederation and the state constitutions reflect the fear of executive abuses that they've seen from the British, and so there's very weak executive power or no executive power at all in the case of the Articles of Confederation, and the power lies in the legislative branch. And then you're going to see that the fear of the masses as well, that even though there has been widespread support for the revolution, only those who are property owners are going to be able to vote. They're not going to let just anybody vote. As the country matures, so does the sense of national identity and national culture. While there had been some coming together of the nation during the rebellion period, there's still a lot of regional identity, and the culture seems to still be largely based on British and European culture. And as the country develops, there becomes more uniquely American ideals and uniquely American identity. One way that begins to develop is the War of 1812. And while there are many differences of opinions about going to war and participation in the war, from the War of 1812, America shows, first of all, that they are able to hold on to their country. And so there's a sense of pride in all Americans that they were able to do that. But then there also becomes war heroes, people like Andrew Jackson. And so that begins to, that everybody in the country can relate to. And so that begins to strengthen the idea of American identity and American culture. Another element of American culture is American art and literature begins to develop. And one major example of that is the Hudson River School. That's the artist involved in the Hudson River School out of New York City. They make landscape art or wilderness art, and while there are some European elements to it, it is uniquely American and celebrates the identity of hope and of awe in the American landscape, of the future of the American country, and how much land and opportunity we have out there. And so this new identity is growing in the American people leading up to the Civil War. Learning Objective Identity 1 looks at how competing conceptions of national identity are expressed in the development of political institutions and cultural values from the late colonial through the antebellum periods. And then the question that goes along with that is how and why have debates over American national identity changed over time? So we've just looked at a lot of change, and that would probably be the question for this one, or causation. But we haven't looked at continuity. And so let's look at a few continuities that you would want to include in any essay on this. That Americans believe that as Americans, religious freedom is really important, Enlightenment ideas, Republican government, individual rights, those sort of things are really important, last throughout the entire time period. In terms of power, the elite are still really powerful. Now you see towards the end of this period, the age of Jackson and the common man. And so that it's beginning to change, but for most of this period, and even till the end of it, elites are still in control. Are they ever gone? And then regional differences are definitely still an issue, especially that good old topic of slavery is still a big concern. Learning Objective Identity 2 relates to the question, how and why have debates over American national identity changed over time? And this one is addressing how Manifest Destiny, territorial expansion, Civil War, and industrialization affected beliefs about progress and the national destiny in the 19th century. This learning objective starts with Unit 4, and we just talked about Unit 4 with the developing national identity. But despite that national identity, there are also some groups within the nation that are developing their own identities, and they see things, especially progress, a little bit differently. As the country expands westward, they're encountering the American Indians again, and so they're pushing them further west. What you're also seeing during 1800 to 1848 is those natives who have tried to kind of work within the American system in the States that's not being appreciated, and they're being pushed off their land, and this is the time of the Trail of Tears and being pushed to reservations. And so their idea of progress and national destiny is not very good. However, the American idea of progress and national destiny is it's ours and get out of the way. The other group that is moving west at this point is the Mormons, and they move to Utah to attain religious freedom. So their idea of progress and destiny is we will move to this area out west and live as we want so we won't be persecuted anymore. ID2 also deals with Unit 5 and Manifest Destiny, which is built on the belief of Europeans being racially and culturally superior to everybody else, and that it is the destiny of the European to take over the continental United States as we know it today. And that means also that they are going to pretty much ignore or push out of the way anybody who's already there, natives, Mexicans, Chinese, whoever the case may be, and instill American values and culture. Another debate about progress that develops as a result of the movement westward is the debate about slavery and whether slavery should be extended into the new territories. Americans also began to develop the idea from 1844 to 1877 that the Pacific is not the barrier to American manifest destiny, and that we should expand beyond our borders and begin to develop trade relationships with other countries, and hopefully a dominance in that trade as well. One area that we expand into before the Civil War is Matthew Perry. No, not the guy from Friends, but Commodore Matthew Perry goes to Japan and demands they open up trade to the United States. The ultimate goal is China, but we'll settle for Japan in the meantime. After the Civil War, the country has to be reconstructed, and it's reconstructed with a northern lens because they won the war. And so basically their idea of progress is going to be getting rid of slavery and universal manhood suffrage. Through the 14th and 15th Amendments, African Americans are given citizenship and the right to vote. However, those are going to be stripped away in the next time period after Reconstruction ends. Another debate over progress from Unit 5 is the debate over the 14th and 15th Amendments from women. Women and African Americans had been partners in a reform coalition, and the 14th Amendments, the language of them, are about men, not about women. It was left out because they didn't have the votes in Congress to get the rights for women. People after the Civil War were pretty much on board with giving equal rights to men, but not women. And so women felt like they were abandoned by the African Americans who continued to support the 14th and 15th Amendment after it did not include women. And of course they were told by African American leaders of the time that, hey, this is our time and then it can be your time later, but we've waited a really long time. And so women get frustrated and kind of separate themselves from African Americans and that coalition, and then you see their movement becoming more focused on attaining the right to vote rather than a broad spectrum of reforms. After the Civil War, the United States enters into a period of prosperity due to expansion west and the rise of big business. And big business becomes very powerful in the United States. And this is seen as something that is both appropriate and inevitable by business leaders and many Americans. As I mentioned before, this period in Unit 6 is called the Gilded Age. And it's called the Gilded Age because it looks really pretty on the surface, but once you start digging, it's not very pretty at all. It's just a thin veneer of pretty. And one of the things that's going on is that big business is very powerful. And by many, it is interpreted by many that government is in the pockets of big business and that big business is doing whatever they want and making laws that benefit big business, and which is fine with those who are benefiting, but those who are not are very suspect and want that to change. During this period, there is a recognition by some of the wealthy men in America that there is a responsibility to those less fortunate, and Andrew Carnegie is one of them. He develops this idea of the gospel of wealth. And basically, his idea is that the rich should donate money for the public good. He does not necessarily believe in giving handouts to individual people, but in donating money for libraries and things like that people can help themselves. Some people during this period did not agree that the corporate ethic was creating progress in American society, and they wanted to change the corporate ethic, some by adopting a utopian type of society, and others with the social gospel, not to be confused with the gospel of wealth. The social gospel is the idea, it's a religious idea that Christians should take care of one another and redistribute and help out within their societies. Other groups that challenged their prescribed place in society during the Gilded Age were African Americans and women. African Americans during this time were losing rights in the South, especially that they had gained during Reconstruction. And there was still a lot of discussion about how now that slavery was over, African Americans could be accepted into mainstream society. And Booker T. Washington was the leader of a movement where he really thought that the key to success was through economic equality, that if African Americans proved their worth in the economy, that would lead to political and social rights in society. He had a lot of people that disagreed with him, but that was his idea. And then as far as women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton continued to work for women's suffrage during this period and challenged the idea that women were not fit to vote. For ID2, there are a number of possibilities on how you could see this on the AP exam. Change over time is always an option about different ideas about progress and national destiny or causation. Another option would be a comparison, how different groups see progress and national destiny from Unit 4 through Unit 6. Another option, especially for short answer, but I guess it could be a long essay too, would be which event was most important in shaping the American ideas of progress and national destiny. Or as a whole for this topic, periodization is an option about when a national identity developed or certain changes in the national identity. Those could all be good questions. Identity 3 is the last learning objective that relates to how and why have debates over American national identity changed over time. This one is specifically dealing with how conflict in the United States has influenced public debates about American national identity in the 20th century. World War I led to significant debates in the country about what the role of Americans should be overseas, and were we people who were isolationists and who stayed in our side of the world and didn't get involved, or was it our responsibility to promote democracy and freedom for all peoples? In the beginning, the idea was no. Wilson promised he was going to keep us out of the war, but then things like the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram came along, and we ended up involved in the war. Then when the war was over, Wilson negotiates a peace treaty which will maintain American involvement in world affairs through the League of Nations. And when he brings that treaty home to the Congress, Congress refuses to ratify the treaty and to join the League of Nations. And so after the war, America is reverting back and seeing itself as isolationist again. And that pretty much continues through the 20s and 30s, kind of a unilateral policy. We're going to do what we want to do, not necessarily completely staying out of things, but refusing to get involved in war and definitely trying to stay out of European involvements. A couple of things we do get involved with. We change our position in Latin America. We go from trying to tell Latin America what to do through the Roosevelt corollary and dollar diplomacy to the good neighbor policy of Hoover and Roosevelt. And that really comes about because we don't have any more money, because of the Depression, but also because we want them as allies against the Europeans and the problems in Europe. In the 30s, as tensions begin to heat up in Europe, the United States wants to stay out of it. And so a bunch of neutrality acts were passed saying, basically banning the United States from trading with countries who were at war and stuff like that. However, by 1939, as tensions are escalating, Congress begins to back off those neutrality acts and establishes the cash and carry plan in 1939, which allows the British and other governments which we support to come and, as long as they come and get the weapons that they need and pay cash for them, we will continue to trade them. So America is a bit confused at this time about whether they want to be isolationist or not. Another debate that results about American identity during the 1930s is that of the American dream, capitalism, and individualism in America. In the past, those have been big things, and the American dream seems to be threatened by the Great Depression. And Roosevelt's solution is the New Deal, but the New Deal pretty much creates a limited welfare state. And some people are okay with that, and some people are not, and some people think it's not enough. In the past, the American government hasn't done much to cushion the effects of laissez-faire capitalism on those who are not succeeding in that kind of world. And so there's a lot of questions about whether that's the proper thing to do. During the Great Depression, the New Deal pretty much creates relief, reform, and recovery programs. And one example of a relief program that is also very indicative of the American identity is the Federal Writers Project. And the purpose of the Federal Writers Project was to put writers who were out of work or people who did research, teachers, educated people, white-collar workers, back to work. And so what they did was they wrote guides about every state in the country, about highways, and big cities. You can also see on here you have slave narratives from the state of Missouri, but they blended travel information with histories and geography, and so it was kind of a celebration of what America is and how Americans see themselves. The New Deal also brought debates from either side. Conservatives thought the New Deal was doing too much. Populists thought the New Deal wasn't doing enough. On the left, you have Huey Long, and Huey Long was a governor and then senator from Louisiana, and he argued that Roosevelt's programs weren't doing enough. If he could limit the wealth in the country and then use that to create programs for old people and poor people in America, he thought that he could fix the Great Depression. And then on the right, you have a political cartoon about Roosevelt not liking the decisions of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court tended towards the conservative because most of the court was appointed in the 1920s, and Roosevelt basically, and they kept overriding his New Deal decisions. And after his election in 1936, where he does really well, he decides that he's going to introduce a court packing bill which will allow old justices, or kind of force old justices into retirement, or to appoint somebody else on the court that would make the court more liberal. This brings a lot of contempt from people that Roosevelt's abusing his executive power and that he can't do that. And so it never actually happens, but it does serve to make the court more open to Roosevelt's reforms. Essentially, some people in the country think we're not doing enough to help people in the Great Depression, and then other people think we are doing too much. Although the New Deal doesn't fix the American economy, basically war does that with World War II, the legacy of the New Deal is a more liberal government and a limited welfare state. And the programs that are created during the New Deal become a part of the American identity. And when Reagan comes to power in the 1980s, promising to limit the scope of the federal government, he finds very quickly that attacking some of these programs would not be a smart political decision, and many politicians since have found the same thing because they've become entrenched in what the American people expect from our government. Some of those programs would be Social Security and the FDIC that regulates the American banking system. That one necessarily didn't come under fire, but these policies have become entrenched in our government. One thing to note about the New Deal is that although many other countries in the world at this time turned their back on democratic governments because they were failing them, and they wanted more powerful government to lead them through this difficult time, Americans hold on to their identity of democratic government. World War II is a huge turning point for the United States in terms of world power. Basically, after World War II, they emerge as the world power. During the war, Roosevelt and Churchill pretty much argue that the Allied position is to advance democratic ideals. However, there are some debates at home about who the United States is due to some of the actions they take during the war. One of the things they do that is questionable is the Japanese-American internment camps, and putting the Japanese, although most of them, there was no signs of guilt that they were helping the Japanese in any way, they were placed in internment camps, which seems to go against ideas of freedom and democracy and liberty. Another questionable decision that brought debate in the United States was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. Many felt it was the right thing to do to show American power, to shorten the war and save American lives. However, others thought that using such untested technology that wiped out so many civilians was not the most ethical thing Americans could do. After World War II, the United States emerges as the most powerful government in the world. The second most powerful government in the world is the Soviet Union, and that's going to spark ideological debates. It's also going to spark a lot of debate in this country about how we fight the Cold War. One of those things is power of federal government. The United States has long had a debate about the power of the federal government, the power of the executive branch of the federal government. If you remember our discussions of Unit 2 and 3 earlier, that basically the American people tend not to trust a powerful executive. And a couple of issues that come up, the Gulf of Tonkin, which gives Lyndon Johnson the ability to commit troops of his own accord and increase the war in Vietnam. Cambodia, where Johnson and Nixon are making strikes that the American people are not aware of, which culminates in the War Powers Act that the executive has to let Congress know what's going on. Another conflict is acceptable means for pursuing international and domestic goals. What will we allow our government to do? A lot of questions come up about this nuclear war and the fear of nuclear war, the arms race and how much money this country is spending on arms buildup and the environmental effects of all of that, as well as the, obviously, potential death toll. War and anti-war sentiments. Do we want to go to war? A lot of people were like, where is Vietnam? What is Vietnam? Why are we there? And many people were protesting war, especially increasing in the late 1960s and the 1970s. Another question that emerges with the Cold War is how much liberty will we lose in exchange for order? You see this in the Second Red Scare in the 1950s, where Joseph McCarthy goes after people who are communist or who he believes to be communist and pretty much ruins their lives, even though they may not even be communist, forces people to name names of people that they believe to be communist, even if it's not true. The other issue is the countercultural movement and the fact that many people are protesting things such as the Vietnam War, nuclear buildup, and those protests often lead to a violent confrontation with law enforcement. And the picture here is an example from Chicago at the Democratic Convention in 1968. And so, again, how much order will we exchange, or how much liberty will we lose in exchange for order? Do people have the right to protest, and when should police violently put it down? There are a number of possibilities for this particular learning objective on the AP exam. One of them would be change over time in how America sees itself as a world power, liberalism and how liberalism changes over time, especially if you incorporate Johnson and Carter into this, or foreign policy, how foreign policy is changing over time. Periodization would also become important, like when does America become a leader in the world, the beginning or the end of liberalism. In terms of comparison, also looking at like how Americans see themselves during the war and after the war in World War I and World War II. Before we get into the next questions and learning objectives, let's take a moment to ponder this picture and think about what it says about our American identity that this t-shirt was created. Have you pondered? By the way, I think I should go on record as saying that my child picked out this shirt. I did not pick it for him, although every time he wears it, I am accused of picking it out for him. The second question for the theme identity is about how have gender, class, ethnic, religious, regional, and other group identities changed in different eras. So the first question is looking at the American identity as a whole, and this one is looking at specific regional or group identities. ID4 is taking us back to the first three units of the course and looking at how interactions between the colonizing groups, Africans and American Indians, shaped the group identity of those different groups. From Unit 1, we talked about this one before, how the Spanish, particularly, came in and tried to force their religion, gender roles, the economy, everything on the natives and how they really did not react very well to that. And we looked at examples of the Spanish mission system and Juan de Onate. So go back and look at your other outlines for how that relates to identity. The British relationship with the slaves in colonial America was never really good. They, from day one, had the feeling that they were better. The British had arrived in families and so had no need to intermarry with the natives, and so they were always treated as property. And they were forced to conform to the religious and the cultural beliefs of the British. And so the Africans tried to hang on to their culture as much as possible in order to kind of have something for themselves and to keep their strength. One of the best examples of trying to hold on to their own culture is voodoo. And the British and most Europeans forced the slaves to practice Christianity. And what voodoo does is kind of blends African traditions with Christianity, specifically Catholicism. And so what you see is that there's a God, there's one God, and then there are spirits that you have a ceremony and you call into the body for healing and other purposes. But those spirits often have a lot of the same characteristics as Catholic saints. So again, the blending of those two ideas. Voodoo is a bit more fatalistic. This is what the spirits have done to me. This is what God has done to me. And there's a big focus on healing. They also incorporate African traditions of healing, of dance, of singing, that sort of thing, into the voodoo rituals. For the natives during the colonial period, European contact led to demographic and cultural changes. The societies were dying out. Introduction of alcohol and better weapons was making things more violent and having huge impacts on societies. And so there was a huge escalation of the intensity of fighting. One thing that happens is called tribalization, where basically there are changes into the tribes, based on, in the culture of the tribes based on the experiences they've had with the Europeans. An example of that would be the Catawba Nation, which is in South Carolina, and they are basically a tribe that is created out of the remnants of other tribes. Because they had gotten so small, the population had died out due to disease and warfare, and so they created a new tribe to keep defending themselves against the Europeans. After the French are pushed out in North America, that leaves less Europeans for the natives to play off of one another. And then after the creation of the new nation, that leaves even more bargaining power for the natives. And so what you see during the Unit 3, 1754 to 1800, is the natives desperately trying to carve out a place for themselves, either by joining together or by fighting the natives, or joining together and fighting the natives. Pontiac's rebellion happens after the French and Indian War, and basically they're trying to take control in the West and mark that area for themselves, and we've talked about that before. And then after the American Revolution, Chief Little Turtle and the Western Confederacy bunch of native groups who have joined together to try to stop the American expansion west and to develop a line that stops the Americans in saying this is native land. It doesn't really work out for them, but they're still attempting to try to carve out their own identity and their own place in the Americas. The government created after the Revolution does not address the rights of all groups and leaves some groups out. One of those is slaves. The Constitution doesn't deal with slavery. The Founding Fathers refused to address and say, we're going to outlaw slavery completely. Instead, they compromise and continue to allow it to happen and create regional divisions. Other states, in their state constitutions and state governments, begin the steps of abolishing slavery. They don't just outright abolish it all at once. But you see in states like Pennsylvania where they have a gradual emancipation law where they say they don't necessarily free the slaves that already exist, but they say that in the future you can't enslave someone who is born for life, that you can only enslave them for a certain amount of time and begin to basically wipe out slavery in their communities. Another group that is not given full rights is women. And we talked about before that Abigail Adams had written John Adams during the Constitutional Convention and said, don't forget the ladies. John ignores his wife, and women are not given the right to vote or participate in colonial governments. While the Constitution is not perfect and leaves groups out, these ideals of liberty and democracy reverberate around the world during this time period, 1754 to 1800. You see revolutions in France and in Haiti, and we've talked about these before, not in the videos, but just in world history and in class. And then it also has an impact on Latin America, a little after the time period, but that they demand independence from Spain and Portugal. Probably the biggest possibility here, besides just individual multiple choice questions about this topic, would be compare and contrast, to compare and contrast how African Americans deal with develop an identity versus how Native Americans develop an identity. And obviously change over time is always going to be an option as well. Learning Objective ID 5 also answers the question, how have gender, class, ethnic, religious, regional, and other group identities changed in different eras? And ID 5 is specifically dealing with how have economic, political, social, and ethnic factors formed regional identities. So this one's all about regional identity. As discussed earlier in this video and in several other videos, in Unit 2, in 1607, when the British settled North America, there are 4 distinct regions that are created as a result of that settlement. If you don't know this by now, you need to know it. It's probably going to be on the test the number of times it's shown up in these videos already. In addition to the 4 distinct regions that developed during the colonial period, you also see as the colonies develop and get a little more mature and actually become a country, another regional development that happens is that you have conflict between the more established areas of the colonies or states and their territory or their back country. And you see this concern in Virginia with the frontier versus tidewater conflicts, and this is also true of Shays' Rebellion in Pennsylvania. And in both of these cases, what's happening is that the territorial people have different concerns than the people in the more established areas, one of them being natives and fighting with Native Americans. And Shays' Rebellion results from the people on the frontier feeling like the colonial government isn't doing enough to protect them from the natives and giving in to the natives. Another thing that happens is you have a new group that's developing along the frontier or settling along the frontier, which is the Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish come from Ireland. They've been displaced there by the British, and they are kind of a rowdy bunch who are not necessarily, they're Protestant, they're not Irish, and they are Presbyterians mostly, but they're a little less uptight Protestants than the Protestants in the colonies so far. They bring their distilleries, they like their alcohol, they are not as easy to settle as the Germans are. They don't create permanent settlements. They're always on the move, and a lot of the settlers aren't very fond of the Scots-Irish. By 1800, 3 distinct regions have developed in the United States as a result of the growing economy and improved transportation. The improved transportation would be canals, early railroads in the Northeast, and then the steamboat, which allows for a lot more transportation along the rivers. The Northeast, which is like what we would have called in the past New England and the Middle Colonies, and the Midwest, which was the Old Northwest, so like Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, all of those areas are coming into cultivation and growing, and they have a large tie to the Northeast. However, the South still remains highly agricultural, producing cotton and other cash crops, and so they are not as intertwined with the Northeast and the Midwest, although they do trade with them somewhat, but they're just not as interdependent as the Northeast and the Midwest. While a national and international market is developing during this time, regional interest and ideas seem to overshadow national concerns a great deal. And as I think I mentioned either earlier in this video or in another video, you did an activity on this in Unit 4, I believe, called Sectional Identities or something like that, sectional differences. So you may want to hunt that down and look at all of the specific issues that are going on. For now, here's a couple of examples. In the North, they do not like slavery. They don't really have a lot of need for it, and it's pretty much been phased out. They like tariffs because that protects their business, and they are pro-bank. They like the national bank. They like the bus. The cartoon here is about the embargo that Jefferson put in place in 1807, and they have embargo spelled backward called "Oh Grab Me," and the North was highly opposed to Jefferson's embargo. The West concerns are somewhat different than those of the North. In terms of slavery, it depends on where you're talking about, and who's settled in that region, because if it's Southern farmers who have moved into that area, then they may promote slavery, where if it's further north, then perhaps not. They are anti-bank in the West. They think that the bus is corrupt, and so they don't like the bank in the West. And they are very pro-internal improvements. The government helping build railroads and canals and transportation, because they're dependent on that to trade and also to make it easier to access where they live. The South is pretty different from the North, and somewhat different from the West. In terms of slavery, they're a big yes. They're anti-bank as well. They don't much care for the bank. They're more states' rights people, and again, they think it's run by Northern people who are benefiting from it. They're anti-internal improvements, more because they just don't benefit from it than anything else. And then they are very anti-tariff because it hurts them. Just a quick reminder on the tariff. The South is always anti-tariff. The North is very pro. In the North, it protects their industry from foreign business. But in the South, they are affected for two reasons. One, they export a lot of cash crops to Europe. And when the American government puts tariffs on things from Europe, then Europe puts retaliatory tariffs in place. And so that hurts the price of their goods. Plus, they buy a lot of consumer goods, and if there's a tariff, then it makes those consumer goods more expensive for them. regional tensions in the antebellum period are exacerbated by the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is a religious revival that's going to encourage social reform. One of the things the Second Great Awakening does is encourage the role of the woman as the spiritual leader of the household. And during this time period, what develops is the idea of the woman not as the revolutionary period, as Republican motherhood that continues, raise a good citizen, but also raise a good Christian, and that women are in charge of the domestic sphere of the house. They're in charge of the home life, of setting a good moral example. The Second Great Awakening is especially appealing to middle-class women. And why middle-class women? Well, maybe poor working-class women are interested, but they can't really take on all the reform activity because they work. And upper-class women, not so much interested. So bored housewives, basically, are taking on this call to be the cult of domesticity and to make reforms. Women begin to advocate for women's rights, more education, kind of down the line, the right to vote. But they also get involved in a number of other issues, abolition being one of them, another being temperance. The growth of cities and immigrants during this time has led to a lot of problems with alcohol in the country, and that affects the American family, and so women are concerned about it. They also get involved with urban reform as these cities grow. The trash, the unsafe drinking water, the pollution, women are involved in making reforms about all of these things. The Second Great Awakening also encourages the abolition movement, and a couple of early leading reformers in the abolition movement are Richard Allen and David Walker. Richard Allen was a Methodist minister who bought his freedom from slavery, from his owner. And he at first had to go, when he would preach to African American audiences, and they would have to go early in the morning or late at night to avoid getting in the way of white services. And he began to think that maybe building African Americans their own churches would be valuable. And that, of course, led to a lot of debates about separation of worship and what kind of problems that could cause. And as you will recall later on, the black churches are really important in the spread of the civil rights movement, especially Martin Luther King and the Southern Leadership Conference. So this is a huge deal in creating community for African Americans. David Walker is another important guy. David Walker essentially wants freedom now. He begins to preach the idea that abolition should happen now, not in like some faraway time, eventually kind of thing, but abolition should be something that happens tomorrow. And he also talked about how they shouldn't be sent, that slaves, once they're freed, should not be sent back to Africa, but should enjoy the same rights of citizens that white people have. Surprise, surprise, slavery continues to be a regional issue in Unit 5. And in fact, the tension is heating up between the North and the South over slavery. Abolitionists in the North, even though they're not a huge majority at this time, are creating a pretty high-profile campaign. And later things like Uncle Tom's Cabin will get more and more people, and the fugitive slave law in the Compromise of 1850. Those are all going to get people on the bandwagon of abolition. People who before kind of were like, I could give or take slavery, or that's not my problem. The South becomes more and more defensive about slavery, arguing that it's the state's right to determine whether they have slaves or not, and threatening nullification of federal laws. In fact, they argue that slavery is a positive good and begin to make arguments like it's better to be a slave than an industrial worker, and the slave's life is so much better, and things such as that. So tensions are high during this period. Despite these rising tensions, there's still attempts to compromise by the politicians in this country. One example would be the Compromise of 1850. Now, there's been compromises about slavery before. There's compromises in the Constitution about slavery, and then there was the Missouri Compromise, the 3630 line, that was established. And basically what it decided was the rest of the Louisiana Territory, slavery would be decided by the 3630 line. Anything south of 3630 would be slave territory. Anything north of 3630 would be free territory. And then the country kept expanding, and so new decisions had to be made about slavery. Texas was admitted as a slave state, but then the rest of the Mexican cession is now an issue. California needs to be admitted yesterday because of the gold rush and all of the issues there. It wants to become a state in 1849, and so it must be decided whether it will be free or slave, and that prompts the Compromise of 1850. And so it admits California as a free state, but then allows all the rest of the Mexican cession to determine whether it will be free or whether it will be slave by what they call popular sovereignty. And so people are going to vote and determine. This also establishes a stricter fugitive slave law. So everybody's getting a little bit of what they want at this time. Another issue over slavery that arises is the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The issue here is that Nebraska and Kansas are supposed to be free states as determined by the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. However, a senator from Illinois wants to encourage the settlement of Kansas and Nebraska so that he can push for a railroad line to be built from Chicago, his state, out west. And so he needs more people to come there. So he wants to renegotiate Kansas and Nebraska. And what he wants is for them to have popular sovereignty. And his argument is that there's, a few slaves in Kansas, therefore everybody in Kansas is going to vote to have slaves. And then Nebraska will be a free state. And so it'll keep the balance in the Union. And this creates a lot of trouble because as the voting happens for popular sovereignty, both sides are sending in people to vote on the issue, and a bloody mess ensues. And pretty much the compromise over free states and slave states has broken down. And this also leads to the falling apart of national political parties and basically the end of the Union. As mentioned before, Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to lead to the downfall of national political parties. Basically, the political parties can't avoid the issue of slavery anymore. And of course, that's going to lead to division because the North is going to be anti-slavery and the South will be pro-slavery. So the Democratic Party splits into the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party, and then a new party emerges which is only popular in the North and the West because its platform is free soil, where no slavery is allowed in new territories, and that is not going to be popular in the South. The Republican candidate for president wins the election in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, and that will lead to the Southern states seceding from the Union. After the Civil War, there's a change in the South temporarily under radical Reconstruction, and African Americans are allowed to take office and represent the South, at least temporarily. Hiram Revels is the first African American elected to the Senate. He represents Mississippi. He's a Republican. He doesn't serve his full term because he gets a job as president of a college. Blanche Bruce is another African American who serves as a congressman or a senator, from Mississippi, and he is the first African American to serve a full term as a senator. After radical Reconstruction, however, the South begins to dismantle all the legislation that took place during radical Reconstruction, and it will be quite some time before African American representatives are seen from the South again. After the Civil War, a new regional issue emerges, and that's of the issues of the urban worker and the urban regions of the country. A great conflict develops between labor and management, and who should take care of the laborer and share of the resources. And labor unions develop to represent the laborer. There are two major unions that develop at this time. First, you see the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor, their goal is to really reform the process of labor and the relationship with management. The Knights of Labor allows skilled and unskilled workers, it allows African Americans, and it allows women. It does not allow Chinese, though. The Knights of Labor falls apart. After a while, though, they're trying to do too much. Their platform is too broad. And the most powerful labor union in the country becomes the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor is focused on what they call bread and butter union issues. Basically, they're concerned about wages and working conditions. They keep the platform small and focused. The American Federation of Labor only allows skilled workers, and they do not allow African Americans, and they are not fond of immigrants either. In the South, the regional issues remain the same. The South isn't really changing after the Civil War. They're not really interested in moving beyond agriculture, and so sharecropping is going to persist. There are some attempts to create industrialization in the South, and that's called the New South, but for the most part, it's sharecropping. As a reminder before we discuss possibilities, Identity 5 was asking about the role of economic, political, social, and ethnic factors on the formation of regional identities. And so probably some ideas for questions here would be causation. How do those four things impact regional identities? A comparison between two regions. Also periodization. Why at certain points are regional identities coming about? What would be the best point? Like, for example, conflicts leading up to the Civil War. Why is this the point where the Southerners stop seeing themselves as Americans? Those would all be good options for Identity 5. I wish I could tell you that we're done, but unfortunately we have 3 more learning objectives for identity. Is this what your face looks like? This is what my face looks like. Maybe you should draw me a picture on your paper right now of what your face looks like. Remember to keep it appropriate. Identity 6 is still relating to the overarching question, how have gender, class, ethnic, religious, regional, and other group identities changed in different eras? And Identity 6 is pretty much dealing with migration and how migration within and to the United States has influenced the growth of racial and ethnic identities in the country. First of all, the dates at the top of this slide are incorrect. It should be 1754 to 1800. As the new country is founded and Americans begin to push west, and we've seen this before in different topics, the Europeans are challenging the natives are trying to fight back, and the Battle of Fallen Timbers is a good example of what happens in that eventually the United States has the stronger army and defeats the Western Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and we make them sign the Treaty of Greenville, and we get access to Ohio, and pretty much begin to push back the natives. This slide is also incorrect on the date. It should be 1754 to 1800. And while the Americans, the British colonists, former British colonists, are pushing the natives out of the way and not really having a lot of interaction and cultural blending. What you see in the western part, where the Spanish are controlling things, is that mission settlements persist, and that there's a lot of cultural blending there. A couple of examples would be corridos, which are stories, like Spanish romances. They often have a subversive quality to them that the colonists and natives who have blended with them create to spread ideas of revolution and anti-Spanish sentiments, because the Spanish are so controlling there. You also see the vaqueros, who are highly skilled mestizo and Native American cowboys. They don't necessarily always own the land, but they're very skilled workers on the ranches who train the horses, and very valued in Western society. So there's a bit more blending of the cultures and opportunity for natives in the Spanish colonies. Thus, what you're going to see is in the West, there is a bit more acceptance of cultural blending, and the West, for pretty much the foreseeable future in American history, is going to be a bit more diverse and welcoming of diversity. The dates on this one are correct. Again, ID 6 is about conflict, and what kind of conflicts over identity and assimilation are brought in by immigration and migration within the country. And naturally, the Irish and the Germans coming in are going to challenge the Protestant British mentality, and so there's going to be a lot of conflict, and we've talked about that before. In the Northeast and the Northwest, you see much less of that in the South, because immigration really, you don't see as much of it in the South because of the economy there. And and the reliance on slave labor. So immigrants, there's not a lot of opportunity for them in the South. In the years before the Civil War, there is a huge population move west, and what we'll see here is a lot of conflict over different groups who are moving west: the Chinese, the African Americans, and the Mormons. Here you see examples of Chinese immigrants who are working out west. On the left, you see Chinese immigrants who are working on the railroad, and then on the right, you see Chinese immigrants working, panning for gold. And the Chinese came to America. China at that time, lots of upheaval. This is the era of the Opium Wars, the fall of the Qing, the decline of the Qing dynasty in the late 19th century. Not a lot of opportunity. They're falling behind. So people are looking for opportunity, and they come to America. But the Chinese are seen as very challenging to the American way of life. If they don't like the Irish because they're Catholic and not Protestant, they really have issues with Chinese culture. They're not always, well, most of them are not Christians, and so just a very different way of life. They also talked about how the Chinaman who eats rice is going to be able to make it and work for cheaper than the man who needs a steak, and things such as that. So there's a lot of racism at this time against the Chinese, which will ultimately result in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which bans immigration from China. Before that, they'll make laws about not allowing the Chinese to own land and not become citizens, and so there's a lot of negative feelings about Asian immigration at this time. African Americans also sought new opportunities in the West. On the left, you see those who are moving to Kansas to take advantage of homestead opportunities in Kansas. These were known as the exodusters. And then on the right, you see African American troops known as Buffalo Soldiers fighting in the U.S. Army in the West. While there was opportunity out west, African Americans still faced a lot of racial discrimination, and the Buffalo Soldiers also found that they had to fight in segregated units. Another group that sought opportunity out west were the Mormons. And the Mormons moved out west to escape religious persecution. They had been before in New York and then in Illinois, and in both cases faced a lot of persecution. So they decided to move west, the opportunity of gold and land out west, so they moved to Utah. But they also face discrimination out west and don't necessarily assimilate into American culture because of their beliefs. Many view them as a cult rather than a Protestant Christian group. They also practice polygamy, and that is seen as not in keeping with the traditional American identity. Now, it must be noted that when Utah becomes a state in the late 1800s, they renounce polygamy, and so Mormons no longer practice polygamy. There's the sister wives, but they're a member of like a break-off organization of the Mormon Church who still practice polygamy. As Americans move west before and after the Civil War, the United States and the United States government feel that they are the superior culture and the superior way of life, and it is their manifest destiny to spread, as we've mentioned many times before. And therefore, the other groups who have settled in the West need to get out of the way, and they are not as important, and they are inferior. And so what you see is a lot of clashes and a lot of questions about what their legal rights are, and in the end, the American government decides that their legal rights are not very much. Examples, I believe we talked about before, Mariano Vallejo, who had been a very powerful, important landowner, Mexican-American. And then, of course, when the Americans move in, they want the land, and so they put him in prison and take away his land. Sand Creek Massacre, the American government, American Army, slaughter a bunch of natives in Colorado. Battle of Little Bighorn, one example of the natives being able to fight back, killing Custer and his troops. But then, of course, from there will come Wounded Knee. So, in the end, natives are pretty much moved to the reservations. During the Gilded Age, you have a huge international migration as well as internal migrations to the cities. But inequalities are going to abound even with the growth of the migrant population. Immigrants, African Americans, women, despite a lot of inequality, are going to find a lot of economic opportunities. And that's really the clash during this period, is they're not being treated very nicely in society, but they are finding economic opportunities. During the period 1890 to 1945, there are two important clashes, if you will, the native-born versus the new immigrant, and white versus black. The native-born versus new immigrant clash really heats up in the 1920s after World War I. The first Red Scare happens because people are really freaking out after World War I and fear communism and anything different, and especially immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. They don't trust them and they target them. And that leads to the Immigration Act of 1924 that sets quotas which favor people from Western Europe rather than Southern and Eastern Europe. You see the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Again, a distrust of Asian immigrants to the United States. They don't target Italian Americans or German Americans. There's several different conflicting feelings about Mexican immigration during this period. During the Great Depression, before the Great Depression, immigration from Latin America had been encouraged despite the quota system from Europe because cheap labor was needed in this country. But then the Great Depression hit, And it was like, oh, we need American jobs, and immigrants threatened that. And so they had deportation of people back to Mexico. Unfortunately, they didn't always deport people who were here illegally or who were Mexican citizens. Sometimes they imported or deported American citizens, and so that created a lot of drama. But then, once the war started, the Second World War, cheap labor was needed again. And so the Bracero program was created, which lasts until the 1960s, which encourages unskilled cheap labor from Mexico, especially migrant farm workers, encourages that immigration into the United States. So the Mexican-American population gets a mixed message from the American government. We like you, we don't like you, we like you. Very confusing. Another thing that happens in 1890 to 1945 is you start to see the buildup of black-white issues again in the country. After Reconstruction, throughout the Gilded Age and before World War I, you see kind of an ignoring of the black-white issues. People were tired of it. They were fatigued. They didn't want to talk about it anymore. Didn't we solve that problem with the Civil War? The slaves were freed. Everything's hunky-dory. And what they're beginning to realize is that maybe it's not. You see the great migration of African Americans into American cities, and what they're finding there is that there's a lot of economic opportunity, but not a lot of racial equality, which is frustrating. And then you see the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, which is showing the capability of African Americans and kind of a celebration of African American culture. And then the World Wars, where the African Americans participate. Again, lots of economic opportunity, not a lot of equality. In the period 1945 to 1980, issues over immigration and conflicts over ethnic assimilation and distinctiveness are going to come from the Immigration Act of 1965 and questions about new immigrants from Asia and Latin America and how they're important to the economic boom of the country, again, providing skilled and unskilled labor, but how they integrate into American society. From 1980 to the present, again, immigration is a huge deal. The continuation from the 1965 Immigration Act that's bringing in more people from Latin America and Asia. The population is going to shift to the American South and the American West, with a lot of people, immigrants, settling in those areas. Again, providing labor force. And a new debate begins to rise over illegal immigration, particularly from Latin America. And immigration laws are going to increasingly focus after 1980 on the issue of illegal versus legal immigration. The typical debates over immigration persist, the taking of American jobs and the threatening of American culture. So possibilities for ID6 would be change over time, like looking at one group and immigration and how that changed over time, how it created cultural distinctiveness or assimilation, or maybe comparison and looking at different migrations and how they shaped the identity of a different group or conflict over assimilation or distinctiveness. So ID6 looked at immigration and its impact. ID7 is looking at class identity and gender roles and how changes in those are going to impact economic, social, and cultural transformations from the late 19th century to the present. From 1890 to 1945, the urban population exceeded rural population for the first time in the 1920 census. And basically what was happening was industrial society was growing. And as a result of the growth of industrial society, women's roles were changing, as were the roles, as were social roles of the time. The internal and international migrations at that time were mostly to the urban areas to be industrial workers, and the development of the working class and the middle class in the cities. Women found a lot of opportunities in the cities at this time. Women could work in the factories, especially working class women. Middle class women also found jobs. Telephone operators, teachers, secretaries, nurses, mostly women's work. Some women were highly educated in specialized fields, and had jobs in those areas. During the World Wars, during this period, they took over a lot of men's jobs in factories, and behind desks. Also, middle-class women in the urban areas found not necessarily jobs, but volunteer work as middle-class reformers, involved in cleaning up the cities, social issues, women's rights movement, all sorts of reform opportunities of the time. The internal and international immigrants to the cities at this time created the cheap labor, basically created the backbone of the success of big businesses at this time, because they were the laborers and they provided cheap labor for the businesses. Their impact socially and cultural was that they settled in these urban areas, created their own ethnic areas, and then the internal migrants, like the African Americans during the Great Migration, create neighborhoods like Harlem, and the Harlem Renaissance, which we talked about before, springs from that. During the next time period, especially in the 1950s, the image of the traditional nuclear family dominated the perception of what was happening. But in reality, this wasn't most people's reality. Many women worked outside the home and were finding opportunities still in women's work, like teachers and nurses and things such as that, or working in factories if they were working class women. But many women were continuing to work outside the home. Because of changes in gender roles and class identity during the previous period and during 1945 to 1980, by the 1960s there was a big clash on social issues between conservatives and liberals. One example of that would be the Warren Court and the decisions that moved towards the individual and towards the liberal. And you have an activity that you did on that, so you may want to go back and take an opportunity to look at those specific cases and what the individual issues were. Another big clash between conservatives and liberals had to do with poverty, and that the growing social classes, especially the poor, the working poor, that have been created by the growth of big business and urbanization and immigration. Johnson really believed, and the more liberal people in society, that government should do something to help those individuals, where conservatives still felt like that, the idea of the American dream, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and take care of yourself and work hard and you will succeed. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether social programs were needed and the size of the government. Another clash came over women's issues. In the 1970s, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, began to spread, and tried to pass. Women's groups were trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment to get women equal rights to men. They didn't feel like that the 14th and 15th Amendments really covered that. And they were having a fair amount of success getting that passed. And then Phyllis Schlafly, which is spelled wrong on here. Oops. Anyway, there should be an L after the H. She comes in and says, maybe we don't want equal rights. Do we want to go to war? This will be the death of the American family, and really convinces a lot of people to go against the ERA, and the ERA ends up dying. In the period 1980 to present, there is a huge income inequality that's developing by the 1990s. The poorest 1/5 of the population, their actual take-home income after taxes fell 12%, while the middle 1/5 fell 3%, where the top 1/5 rose 38%. So income inequality is increasing. According to the 2000 census, the population of the United States was also becoming more diverse. There's over 3 million Muslims in the United States and over 1 million Buddhists, and that should be Hindus. I have a problem. So over 1 million Buddhists and Hindus, that should say, are in America by 2000. Also, in urban and suburban areas, the diversity is growing. The new immigrants that are coming in are creating ethnic communities in the urban areas. But what you also see is that they are quickly moving to the suburbs and to the outer regions of the urban areas, not just staying in the urban centers, and creating more diverse suburbs than in the past. That suburbia up until the 80s and the 90s had still kind of been the white refuge, that they did not have the diversity that other places had, but immigrants had move in by this point, and you begin to see everywhere more diversity. Another change from 1980 to present is a change about women's roles and in class identity. The American economy is changing after 1980 and becoming more globalized, and the amount of industrial production that's happening in the country, we're changing into more of a service sector. And so less men are immigrating to work in factories. And so you see a much larger number of women immigrating to the country to meet the changing needs of the American economy. Women are coming in to work in service roles, to be domestic help, to take care of children and the elderly, and also to work retail jobs. Another change in immigration is that it's not just people coming in for low-skilled, cheap labor kind of jobs. We're also seeing people come in to fill skilled roles, because 40% of immigrants have college degrees. Since 1980, Latinos have become the largest minority in the United States. Most Latinos are employed in the lowest level of the job market. So again, class identity, they're coming in as the cheap laborers for the most part. Amongst the Latino population, they have a poverty rate that is double the national figure. And although many Latinos are here to work the lowest jobs and are in poverty, you also see a growing Latino middle class, especially in urban areas in California and Florida. Another group who's seen a huge increase in population due to the Immigration Act of 1965 is Asian Americans. An Asian American population in the United States has grown increasingly visible since the 1990s. The population is 8 times, the Asian American population in the United States is 8 times what it was in 1970. Asian Americans, we talked about in ID 6, were treated terribly when they came to the United States in the 19th century. But there's been a shift since 1965, and now Asian Americans are seen as the model minority, if you will. Asian American families have a median income higher than whites, and their dedication to education, that stereotypical idea of the Asian who's always studying and all that, makes them the model minority in this country. But Asian American populations are really at the ends of the spectrum on the American class identity. They're either in the poorest sector or they're in the highest sector. So by 1980, the question is, are we a multiracial society? The argument for being a multiracial society would be that the increased visibility of the Latinos and Asians that we just discussed since 1965. Prior to that, while there had been different groups in America, the conversation about diversity was really about black and white. And now there's been more added to the plate. Examples of multiracial society would be, for instance, half of all Asian marriages are to a non-Asian partner in the United States. 30% of all Latino marriages in the United States are to a non-Latino partner. And that we're becoming increasingly colorblind. On the other side of that, there's the argument that Latinos and Asians have kind of been expanded into a larger definition of the white category, and that there's still a pretty significant white-black divide in this country. So the possibilities for ID7 would be causation. So how have the changes in women's roles and class identity led to economic, social, or cultural transformation? Or you could have a comparison. How have those two groups impacted, and maybe one or two of those topics for a comparison? Another possibility here is periodization. So when did the country become multiracial? Changes in the American family. When do you really see a shift in the role of the woman in this country, or in class identity? Do you feel like this? This is how I feel. It's almost over. There's only one more. I think my son's going to kill me one day for all these pictures I've put in here. All right, it's finally the last one. ID 8, Learning Objective 8 for Identity. So this one is asking about how civil rights activism affects the growth of African American and other identity-based political and social movements. And this one should go pretty quickly. We talked about this recently in class. You have PowerPoints on the topic for African Americans and other groups. So I'm going to keep this pretty general or touch on some issues that we haven't yet touched on. So if you don't remember all this, you may want to go back and review those PowerPoints and make sure, especially if you're unsure about different groups besides African Americans. So 1890 to 1945, as we mentioned in the last learning objective, there's not a huge amount being done for African Americans during this time period because people, there's beginning to be concerns again, but people have kind of burned out after the Civil War on talking about black-white issues and the rights of African Americans. There's kind of this belief amongst the white population of, didn't we fix that during the Civil War? I'm tired of talking about that. Let's talk about something else. Of course, the African Americans aren't tired of talking about it. So there's still issues. Great Migration, giving African Americans more economic opportunities, but not necessarily equal rights. A. Philip Randolph tries to bring attention to that with the March on Washington, gets Roosevelt to promise, or gets him to add an executive order that you can't have discrimination in the defense industry. And then Truman decides after World War II that he's going to desegregate the armed services. So there's a bit of progress here. And then later in the 40s, you see Morgan versus Virginia that says that segregation on buses is a disruption of interstate commerce. And as a reminder from earlier learning objective, Mexican Americans are also facing issues at this time, very mixed signals from the American government. Are we welcome? Are we not welcome in this country? By 1945, the move for civil rights is heating up for African Americans, as is the awareness of government officials and the American public, especially in the North and the West, that things do need to change. And so you see different branches of government all taking an active role in making civil rights legislation. The executive branch desegregation of the military by Truman would be an example. The judicial branch, Brown versus Board of Education. You also see Thurgood Marshall becoming the first African American justice of the Supreme Court. Before that, he also he was an attorney for the NAACP, worked in their legal defense unit, and basically what he did was work to bring cases of civil rights to the court to establish precedent and to fight for legal rights for African Americans. In Congress, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, passed, getting rid of the Jim Crow laws. During this time period, there's a huge debate about strategies for African American rights. In the 50s and the early 60s, the idea that prevails is nonviolence, and the idea to get rights is nonviolence, and then what they're really working for is political rights and legal rights and for African Americans. The leadership of those movements, Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and John Lewis for SNCC. Later in the 1960s and the 70s, the movement begins to shift. African Americans are realizing, first of all, that they've achieved some legal rights, but there's still other issues like income inequality, access to jobs, access to education that need to be addressed as well, and that nonviolence isn't always working. And not that these groups are just completely relying on violence, they just don't reject violence the way that the others do beforehand. And so you see examples of that being people like Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, Stokely Carmichael, who starts out in SNCC, but later becomes a bit more radical with the Black Power movement, and then the Black Panthers. Kind of building on this civil rights movement that develops for African Americans, women also begin to demand more equality in society in the period 1945 to 1980. They had been given the right to vote in the period before, but they began to demand more rights, again, to education, to equal pay for equal work, being recognized as equal citizens with the ERA and things such as that. A couple of examples you have is Betty Friedan, who argued in the 1960s in her book The Feminine Mystique that housewives were bored and they needed more to their lives, education, careers, things such as that. You also see the birth of the feminist movement, kind of building on Friedan's ideas, the idea that it's not just voting rights, but that women should have equality in all areas, and so that's the feminist movement. The creation of magazines for women and talking about women's issues like Ms., which is created by Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem also is instrumental in building the Women's Caucus that lobbies Congress and works within Congress for women's issues to be addressed and legislation to be made to benefit women. During this period, you also see other groups that are demanding social and economic equality and sometimes a redress of past grievances. The Latinos, you see Cesar Chavez organizing unions out of the migrant workers and demanding more rights and better treatment and better pay. American Indians begin to demand especially redress of grievances for the things that have happened to them, bringing lawsuits against the American government. Asian Americans, especially Japanese Americans, bring lawsuits against the American government for the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Another group that's brought to the attention of the American people, especially during the 1960s by Lyndon Johnson, are the people that don't necessarily benefit from all the affluence in the country, the persistence and the prevalence of poverty. And the Great Society, the goal of that is to create programs to help people get back on their feet, or to help children who are in poverty get out of poverty. And this was a big goal and movement of liberals during the 1960s and 1970s. There are also critics of this movement, and we talked about that before, and of the conservative movement of the time period. However, even though there are critics of government programs and things such as that, the awareness of this problem persists, and many programs have become a part of the American government and are seen as almost untouchable in politics today because of their popularity amongst the American people. Possibilities for ID8 essay questions or short answer would be change over time, always change over time, about how civil rights activism affected the identities of different groups, like did they achieve their goals, what were their goals, or comparison of two different groups and their goals and their success. Those be the likely ones there. We are finally finished with identity. Make sure that you go back and look at anything I mentioned here that you should go back and study from your notes, and then make sure that you have completed notes on identity.